Well, perhaps let's make a start. Thank you all, gentlemen, for coming on what a busy day. Take some time to listen to, I hope it's a very interesting seminar.
I hope so too.
Brian Bay has been studying biomechanics for many years and has the distinction of, back in the late 1990s, taking the idea of digital image correlation for measuring of displacements of a surface into the third dimension and using X-ray tomography to measure the stresses and strains inside of bone under stress. And he's carried on developing that method and produced software that he used in his own lab for performing that algorithm. A couple of years ago, he visited Research Complex at Harwell for several months and collaborated both on some specific biomechanics projects and developing the software for usability in a variety of other fields, mechanics and geophysics and so forth. And in working towards transferring that software to the Collaborative Computational Project in imaging. So now we're at a point where both Brian has been on a beam time the last several days, studying some biomechanics with some other people that be in the room, as well as being happy to start presenting this code to the greater community. So Brian will talk about digital volume correlation and how it can actually be practically done on a computer. There are several people joining us via Zoom meeting who can hear and ask questions over this microphone and speaker system here. But I'd like to remind them if they could mute their microphones while they're not speaking so we don't get stray noises coming through all the time. And then unmute when you're prepared to ask a question. All right, so Brian,
great.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Robert, and thanks everyone. I apologize, I'm a little bit scratchy today. It's either the dry weather you have here in England all the time, or perhaps beverages consumed last night during the match. I'm not sure which it is, but I'll try to speak up as best I can, but I do apologize. My voice is not so good today. So thank you. This is a process, digital volume correlation, I've been working with for quite some time, and it's continued to entertain me and to be a compelling area of research. I mean, even this beam time, we were looking at soft tissues with phase contrast and seeing detail that I never thought was even approachable with these methods. And so the imaging basis for doing these measurements of deformation during in situ experiments, I think, are all there. And now it's a matter of getting code in place that is flexible enough to allow users to do this for the tough problems. And here's what I'm going to try. I know it's kind of a long list. I'm sorry. This is what I'll try to cover. Just a very brief background, show you some examples of DVC. I do need to talk about the overall structure of this piece of software. I want this to be kind of a practical get started guide. We're going to look at the input file, obviously, that runs and controls the analysis, because that's the part you have to manage as a user. Pre-processing, I've come to call it. There's important stages initially in a project where you have to actually dig in and look at your image data and extract some information from it as a way to set up the process. And that's a part where it's not quite appreciated sometimes, the important role that plays. So I want to make sure that we get that covered. And then processing a measurement point is the fundamental process here. And how that works and what the intricacies of that are need a little bit of reference point. These point clouds I'll talk about are how you define your region of interest and how you set up an analysis. And there's some subtleties there that are very important that I'll try to cover. Strain calculation I'll go over briefly. That's, for me, for my code, that's a post-processing step. There's ways to incorporate strain calculation within the image correlation process itself, but I think it's almost more convenient and flexible sometimes to separate the two. So we're after displacements, and then I'll give you some guidelines and thoughts on how to extend that to strain. And then finally, some of the possibilities that I'm really excited about working with the programmers here, threading and multiple processors, parallel processing, all these things that can speed up code and make it more practical, that I, as a mechanical engineer and material science, don't necessarily have the greatest skills in, but the skills are here, so want to leverage that. So quickly, these are some examples from the Correlated Solutions website. I'll talk about commercial codes briefly in just a moment, but just to give you an idea, the concept is quite simple. You go in and you take an object and you do in situ. In this case, you compress this cylinder or this disc, or you create a structure. This has some reinforcing bars or wires that are embedded in a polymer. And what DVC intends to do, I'm not sure movies, these are short movies, but you get the idea. I won't try to run them. Through the volume, you get displacement and strain information coming from a correlation type process. But you'll notice here, if you look closely, these are carefully crafted samples. If you look very, very closely, you'll see this fine modeling. There's texture that was created as part of producing the sample. They took an epoxy of some kind and mixed glitter into it. It shows up when they do the imaging. And that's a direct analog of speckle that's applied in digital image correlation processes. So we know the process works very well when you have a controlled sample like this that kind of replicates what digital image correlation is doing. And if problems that you're working with fall into that category, you've got some really good options. Correlated Solutions has a digital volume correlation code called VicVolume. Lavision has a StrainMaster DVC. Amira Viso now has a plugin that does digital volume correlation. All of them take slightly different approaches, but they're all available. And by all means, if those codes work for the problems that you're after and you can budget them, it's worth taking a look. They do a very good job. The problem that I've encountered is when you have more complex problems, those codes, at least in my hands, I've had difficulty getting them to work well. And what makes problems complex is geometrically complex regions of interest. When we do these bone mechanics problems and when we do these spine intervertebral disc problems, you don't have a nice cylindrical sample. You have samples of very complicated shape. And you need to be able to reflect that in the process. Texture within the material that you're studying is what the basis of correlation is if you're not creating samples with intentional speckling in them. And that needs to be carefully thought about and coordinated with the processing code to get it to work. There's process parameters. This is, you'll see, as a massive nonlinear optimization exercise. And as with every optimization exercise, there's parameters lying underneath the surface that have to be managed. And if you don't have access to those, you really limit what you can do. And so the idea here was to develop a new code where we can kind of test new ideas, we can tune them more carefully, we can understand fundamentally what's going on, and make it more of a research platform in a sense than just something to push a button and get to run. So here's the complex samples that, these were done a few years ago now, but those are that's a mouse knee. It's probably 3 millimeters across in that dimension. And this is imaged on I-13. We see incredible levels of detail within the structure. These systems are very complex. And this is what we want to see. This sample is compressed inside an in situ rig and imaged under various levels of compression. Then we want to go back and say, what are the displacements and strains that are generated within the sample? So we're dealing with a region of interest that looks like this. They're highly complicated. And if you simply create a simple region of interest and fill it full of points and try to do correlation, there's points that are outside the material, there's points that are overlapping edges of material, there's points that are fully inside. And if you don't control that, you don't get very good results. So the code that I've set up is we can create these complicated regions of interest and really control the analysis a bit more. So these are the complicated things that I'm interested in, and you always encounter these in biomedical work because things just are never created quite very simply. So I've got these little sort of benchmarks along in the presentation here, and this is one of them that I think is quite important, is start or think about digital volume correlation not really as image processing, but as a way to do mechanics. It's not like a filter where you just say, run the filter over this image and let's see what the result is. You really have to think more along the lines of, I'm doing a mechanics analysis that uses image data, and the analysis gets set up as a reflection of the mechanics more than it does as a reflection of the imaging. And along those lines, I've styled the process here similar to the way an analysis process works. If you do finite element analysis in almost any realm, sometimes it's a little hidden that this is going on, but these things all work in a pre-process and post mode. So pre-processing, you're setting up your finite element model, you're creating geometry, you're meshing it, you're selecting elements, you're putting boundary conditions on, all of these things. That process creates an input file that goes to the core processing code. That actually does the FEA process. Those results come back and you read them into a post-processing visualization code. And that style is actually quite nice because it's very flexible, because you can kind of independently tune the results of your analysis. So what I've tried to do with this DVC code is there's this pre-processing stage where you have to really look at your image data. You have to decide clearly what your objectives are. That will influence this point cloud. I'm going to use this point cloud idea extensively. That basically is your region of interest, is a collection of points in space within the voxel space. And each one of those points you're collecting a measurement information from. And it's sort of the accumulation of that point-wise information that leads to the understanding of deformation. And you, of course, have to just configure the DVC input file. How do I just get the code to run? So the process itself is going point by point and doing a correlation between two image volumes, deciding what the displacement is of that particular point, extracted, defined in one image volume in the next one, and that's a displacement vector. Then you go on to the next point. You do the same process, you find a displacement vector. So at the end, you have this family, this cloud of displacement vectors that you then further process. And so this is the strain calculation part. There's some relatively simple MATLAB procedures that are quite good for getting strain information. We use them quite a bit. There's better approaches that require a little bit more coding that I'm interested in developing and other realms use. But for now, the MATLAB approach is pretty good. Okay, so I wanted to show you input file information just to get you thinking along these lines and provide some reference. It's not the most exciting thing to look at, but you have to be able to manage this. So there's the things you would expect. You tell the software what the reference image volume is. You tell it what the one you want to correlate it with is. You just provide paths to the image data. This is a key thing right here. This is a simple text file that describes XYZ point positions. Those are the ones that you want to collect DVC information for. This is something that is, at this point, your responsibility to create. You need to use imaging software, use meshing software to generate point clouds that you're interested in. You can also create quite simple point clouds, though, and one of the things I almost always do is create a simple little test point clouds that you can try out the process. You can see if it's going to work. So usually start with quite simple representations. You look at the process, you get it tuned, get it set up, and then you move on to your more extensive analyses. This is just some file names that you want output to be sent to. We can handle 8 or 16-bit integer image volumes. The way I have it set up now, I didn't want to get into the game of writing input file readers, and so I go back to just raw image data. And if this is not the form that your data comes in, you can create this quite easily with most image processing packages now. And so simple raw data in 8 or 16-bit format is what this starts from. There is a restriction, and these are the kinds of things that we can relax through a little bit of code development. Right now, I'm assuming that these image volumes are the same size. They have the same XYZ dimensions. That's obviously things that can be relaxed a bit with a little front-end coding. But for now, to keep it simple, that's the way I've set this up. Now, here's where you kind of get into the heart of it. And if you've done any image correlation work, you're familiar with the idea of the size of a little subregion. We think of these as pointwise techniques, but I think whether anything is a pointwise technique that's experimental is kind of a philosophical question. There really isn't any such thing as a pointwise technique. you're generally generating information over a small area or small volume in this case. And so we decide on what the subvolume should be. And at every point you're going to look for, the software is creating a little volume around that point. And it is pulling information from the reference image volume about that small subregion around the point, and it's going and using that information to look for a similar region in the next image volume. And I have this set up to be, this is something I spent a fair bit of time on and is embedded in the code. Most codes use a subvolume that's a simple cube, and you take direct voxel information to fill that subvolume. And I've taken more of a sampling approach. I wanted to create subvolumes that potentially had different geometries and had different, more flexible point distributions within them. So right now I have spheres and cubes available. You describe the size in voxels of what you want the dimension of the volume to be. I'll talk about how you set that size. And then you fill it with points. And I fill this typically with randomly distributed points or grids that are not necessarily on voxel centers. What I'm doing is I'm using the same interpolation processes that you use in the correlation volumes to get subpixel displacement and rotation information. One of the things you do have to realize with the solid mechanics problems in particular is that plus or minus a voxel for a displacement value is far too coarse to do meaningful solid mechanics. You need to get a tenth, ideally 100th of a voxel. And the digital image correlation work has shown that this is a valid process. This works. You can get displacement precision with subvoxel if you have extremely good image interpolation and you have extremely good optimization processes. And so that's really the goal. This is a process that has to really be pushed to the limit in order to get meaningful information out of it. So I've got this particular strategy. I'll show you some pictures that describe it a little bit better. This is a little bit of extra code that's not often used, but I found problems where it's convenient to maybe exclude a phase from the measurement. And if you can do that with simple thresholding, then at this stage you can say, tell the subvolume to ignore anything that's outside of a certain threshold range and only pay attention to material that's within a certain range. For multi-phase problems, that's something that can be exploited pretty well. Okay, the last bit, it gets a little bit into process control parameters. You need to define a displacement, and that gets a tiny bit complicated. There's a couple of parameters here that interact with each other. This rigid translation parameter here, that's something I have to describe with a little bit of illustration. Basically what you're saying is the within sample deformation you set a limit on. This is to help set up the interpolation. This is a little bit of an efficiency thing. Offset from this value that you feed the code. I'll show you a little bit more what this translates into. 3, 6, or 12 is, do you want to do translation only, translation plus rotational degrees of freedom, translation plus rotation plus strain degrees of freedom? Most of the work that I've done uses 6, uses displacement and rotations. Strain is something that's a little bit harder to manage from the coding standpoint, and for a lot of problems, I haven't found it to be that helpful. Interpolation type, this is really just for test runs. Trilinear is not good enough for doing very high precision tracking. You need to be at least tricubic. So that was a lot of the coding effort, was getting a good interpolator in place, and it's a place where there's always room for improvements as well. These are, if you do image correlation work, you've seen these as some of the typical underlying correlation functions that are used. And predominantly, these normalized sum of squared differences functions are the ones that I've had success with. If you're used to cross-correlation functions, it turns out that these sum of squared differences functions are functionally identical. They're just a bit different style of setting up the function itself. This is something that I'm actively pursuing, is in problems where the texture that you're tracking is anisotropic. subvolumes that are even dimensioned don't necessarily perform very well. So in other words, if you had fiber reinforced materials, you want to stretch the subvolumes along the fiber direction to get good tracking. And so I've started to work with ways of implementing that. So right now it's pretty simplistic. If you have a sample and you have a dominant fiber direction that happens to be in Z, for example, you can stretch the subvolumes in that direction and you'll get more precise tracking. This can clearly be elaborated. You could achieve local orientation and local anisotropy in the subvolumes by doing a little image processing locally where the measurement point is. That's something that functionally isn't there yet, but this is definitely sort of in a trial and in development stage. But I know a lot of people are working on fiber reinforced materials of various kinds. And this takes, again, a little bit special handling. So that's really it. That's the basics of setting up and running this code. But I do want to try to get quickly to how you make this work. There's a few parameters, but if you don't get things correct, you'll get lost during the tracking process. So spend time in pre-processing. Again, you have to think I'm doing an analysis of the system, not just a straight up measurement. A finite element analyst spends a lot of time getting a model set up. And what you're doing initially is getting a model set up. And sorry, this is a really busy slide, but the basic idea is do some basic visualization and rendering of the image data you just collected. I mean, seems like an obvious thing to do. You're going to do it anyway, but become familiar with the image data. Consider light filtering. It's been shown that small kernel median filters, for example, that remove sort of shot noise are pretty effective in improving DVC tracking. You don't want to get too carried away with filtering. Filters that produce nice images when you do renderings aren't necessarily what you want. You don't want to take information out of the data set with the goal of making it look nicer. This is something that I think is often sort of jumbled up a bit. It's really at this stage that you want to start thinking about what is the subvolume size I want to use. Because when you go to creating these regions of interest in the point clouds, that process you'll see is informed by the subvolume size. So you want to establish that first before you start getting into the detailed region of interest. I'll show you why that is. And then you're establishing run parameters. And this idea of a global starting point is going to be really important in this process. And this is the general idea. So there's a lot to do here. You spend time in this pre-processing stage. If you think that you're just going to go in and click go on the software and get DVC to work, you're not going to get it to work that way. It just doesn't quite pan out. I'm going to use this example. This is the top of the tibia from these little mouse samples. And how do we get a region of interest for this type of sample created? And I'll show you, this is kind of an interesting thing just from a mechanics standpoint, is you look at these biological systems and you often, is that a material or is it a structure? For some reason, a lot of biological structural systems exist on kind of that edge where you can't clearly homogenize this into a material, and yet it's not a full structure with a few struts. In us, these are thousands and thousands of little struts, these little pieces right here. It's really difficult to manage these because you're on that boundary. So what I decided is we need to make the DVC approach adapt to that. Here's 2D sections through that same image data. And you can see right away why the volumetric approach looks promising for materials like this. This is just a projected on a screen view, but there's not only voids that are distributed throughout. This is quite interesting, actually. There's living bones, there's living cells that live in each one of these little lacunae. And they actually communicate through tiny little canalicular networks with each other. So inside our bones is this living network of cells that are talking to each other and trading information. It also happens to be a nice, it wasn't, I don't think, designed to produce DVC efficiency, but it works pretty well for it. So we've got these features. If you look closely, you also see little mineralization differences in here. And so if this were blank, you would not be doing DVC with it. If it's got feature that is somewhat consistent and of a fine enough scale, then it's a good candidate for doing tracking. And here's a little small section just to kind of zoom in a bit. And again, there's a lot of very consistently rendered detail in these samples. Now here's what you think of, and here's what I found difficult with some of the commercial codes. You can't even see it over here, but there's a flurry of little red dots on this image. And zoomed in here, you start to see them. What you're doing for DVC is you're identifying points where you want a displacement value. So each one of these points is going to get processed for displacement. Well, you can kind of see a problem here. We've got some that are just sitting out here in void. There's some points that are right on an edge. Those aren't necessarily going to track very well. These ones fully in the interior are the ones where you've got enough consistent feature to track. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing you do is you have to go in and decide what you want your subvolumes to look like, what size you want them to be. And in the code now, this is something I'm about to implement because it's fairly low-hanging fruit from a coding standpoint, and it's quite useful. I haven't implemented weighting of the points within the subvolumes, but that's coming very soon. But we have basic cubes, we've got spheres, and we have these ones we can stretch. What you need to do is you need to decide what size those should be. So for this bone work, you can see up here there's a couple of example subvolumes. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to find the smallest subvolume size that will track reliably. It needs to have enough feature in it to track. So notice these, there's probably about 3 by 3 by 3 little features in there. That's what you try to achieve, is enough feature that that subvolume is going to be identifiable in the next image volume. And so once you've determined that, that provides a size value. You don't want to be closer than half of that size to a surface. When these subvolumes start to overlap surface, they become quite unreliable in how they track. There's a couple of reasons for that. You've got less information, number one, but also I'll show you some examples of this. There's the correlation function itself becomes distorted when you overlap those edges, and that makes the optimization process quite unreliable. So you need to set this up so a subvolume comes up and touches that edge but doesn't cross over. Here's a little elaboration of that idea. Is the code that I've set up, I'm kind of doing this somewhat in an experimental way, but I'm not using voxel values directly. So what you think of as a subvolume is it's a resampling of the image data. And so a subvolume itself is actually another set of points. So we've got the point cloud, which is all of these points you want to make measurements at. What DVC you do is you basically create another very tight, very small set of points that surrounds that measurement point. Each one of these points, you're going into the image data and you're pulling out a value, either directly as a voxel value or through interpolation. And that whole collection forms the template that you're going to go look for. And so that's what a subvolume is. It's another little cloud of points. And getting this configured in a flexible way has been an important part of getting some of this code to work. So it's kind of a sampling process. So what you end up with, here's really I know I've got acknowledgements of these people, but Kamel Madi, who lots of you know, and Loic Coutois, they were really important in getting some of these ideas instantiated when we did this work, is the point cloud needs to be trimmed down in a sense. So I've got this, you can't see it very well, but there's a blue line here that's inset half a subvolume size, and we're excluding all these points from the analysis. We're excluding these over here. Here's a large void that we're excluding because we don't want subvolume. We'll get unreliable tracking information if we have a subvolume that's largely overlapping that. At the same time, we want to preserve these smaller features. And so the image processing to do that is not easy, but I'm convinced that it has to be done to get control of this process. If you just sort of shotgun a lot of points all through the region, I haven't been able to get that to work reliably. what people try to do is, let's say a subvolume happens to fall over here, they try to look at the performance of the optimization process to see if it's a reliable point or not. And you end up having to set thresholds. You get kind of a number that is a score of how well the optimization worked. You end up having to threshold. Anything that's below this score, I'm going to throw out the information. I'm not comfortable with that. I haven't been able to get that to work reliably. So what I do is you spend the time ahead by really crafting these regions. And here's an example of displacement information that came from, and again, this is just a slice, but we have full volume of this. So we end up with sort of these exclusion zones here. So here's where we're getting information. We've excluded that very near surface. We've got rings around these big voids. That's all done directly by managing the region of interest in an image processing sense. And here's kind of what it looks like in its full-blown instantiation. And this is a process that Kamel largely developed, and he's brilliant at this kind of stuff. Initially, our data looks like this. We can do a segmentation of subtype to decide what is material and what is void by doing some image processing methods. This closure process is a size-controlled thing, and basically what we want to do is those small features we don't want to dodge. We want them incorporated into the analysis. So you can do a closure process where pores, features under a certain size, you temporarily erase in a sense. And then you do an erosion. An erosion is what eases the surface in. So you've now got this managed image volume that's got this complicated shape. And erosion is what gives you that buffer zone where you don't want points to exist. And then you bring in some meshing software. And this software is available for these very complicated geometries. If you were going to do a finite element analysis of this system, you would generate a mesh in a method largely like this. So I think the saving grace of this is a lot of projects, you're going to do something like this anyway if you have any ambitions to build a model. And so this is a elaboration of a process that's going to have several uses for you. And then in the end, you get something like this. Very complicated, intricate distribution of points. There's probably 250,000 points in here. And that is a lot. My code is slow. I will not claim that it's fast. But we're going to figure out ways to make it faster. And even at those densities, we've successfully run these problems. So it's not without pain, but it's functional. But this is what you have to get to in order to do these intricate problems in a DVC context. You have to get to things like this. All right, let me keep forging ahead here. This is the most important thing of the process. The point cloud is extremely easy to represent. It's difficult to generate. From the coding, so from the software standpoint, all it is a text file. And we've got a point ID, which is an arbitrary integer that you decide on. And we have XYZ position within the voxel space. And you'll notice that these are not restricted to voxel centers at all. I keep these as floating positions within the voxel volume. And everything's done through an interpolator. So I think one of the things that really helps with these processes is that traditional idea of what a voxel is being like a little cube. You kind of want to mentally eliminate. A voxel is actually a sampling point with a number associated with it. That's what it is. And so it's a representation of an underlying continuous signal. And if you have a good quality interpolator in there, you completely throw out the concept of voxels as being little things. And you simply treat them as sampling points that I can interpolate within in order to get some reasonable estimate of the image that was underneath. So that really helps in kind of thinking how this is set up. So that's all the point cloud file is. Overlap is something that is always comes up, and people kind of think about how does that work. These point clouds often are spaced such that the subvolume for any particular point will overlap adjacent points. That's a good thing, and digital image correlation work has shown that an overlap of about 0.2. So in other words, you can space the points down to about 0.2 of the subvolume size, and you'll pick up some improvements in measurement quality, mainly from a repeat sampling sort of idea, more of a statistical thing. I'm interested in this. This is an unverified hypothesis, but I want to study this as soon as I get a chance. There's traditional subvolumes where everyth's voxel centered. When you go to the next subvolume over, it shares a majority of information with the subvolume you just generated, the one that you just analyzed. So the overlapping is only picking up a little bit of extra information. I'm intrigued by this idea that if these are all randomly distributed points and you start overlapping, you're doing overlapping of the sampling. And you might think, am I bringing in any new information because the voxels are the same? But interpolators use derivative information as well. So there's actually richer information that goes into the interpolation process than just the voxel values themselves. So I am not a sampling theory person, and I don't know if this will pan out or not. But to me, it makes some intuitive sense. So in my process, when you create these random spheres and you're overlapping them, you're picking up a lot more point-wise information than you would with a more traditional process. So overlapping is a good thing. You should not get too carried away. At some point, it doesn't produce benefit anymore, but some overlapping is quite helpful.
It's the points inside the spheres which are randomly picked.
Yes.
Not just the location of the sphere.
That's correct. Yes, the points inside, that sampling step where you're saying, what is a subvolume, is you randomly picking points inside that sphere. Yeah, that's exactly right. Global starting point. This is a key idea. Let me show you what has emerged as the most successful strategy to manage this process. It's a little bit different than the original strategy that people used for image correlation. And the best way to illustrate that is, this is Correlated Solutions VIC-3D software. It's stereo correlation on surfaces from speckle patterns. You get nice beautiful, spectacular, very precise three-dimensional contouring of things. And this process, sometimes you'll say go. You set up a sub-region size and it'll be successful. Sometimes it won't. And when it isn't, what you do is you go in and pick, there's a little icon here, and you go click on a point, and it will force the software to spend extra time and effort finding where that point is. In other words, doing the displacement tracking process. And if it's successful, it then processes the points in kind of a wavefront fashion. So what you do is you process points by distance from that global starting point. What you do is you move information forward. You know the parameters that worked here. A point close by is going to have similar displacement values. You move that information ahead. That one successfully finds. You move that information ahead. So your analysis sweeps through. That strategy is emerging as extremely reliable and the best way to manage this. So that's what my code does. There's a part in the beginning, like if you have a point cloud that's 250,000 points, there's a part in the beginning where the software takes a little bit of time to get going with the actual DVC. What it's doing is it's sorting that 250,000 points as distance from a starting point all the way through the cloud. But then also what it's doing is it's finding a local neighborhood of points. So you find the 10, 12 closest points, and it's actually going to use information from a group of points as a way to inform the next. So it's doing a 250,000 sorts 250,000 times. That takes a little while, but it's worth doing. Not only for the starting point information, but also for strain calculation. So this is embedded in the commercial codes now. And I've had great success using it in this context and in the DVC context. All right, so now from the standpoint of what really is happening here, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here, but just for those of you that have done nonlinear optimization work, this is what's going on behind the scenes. When you do a two-dimensional image correlation, you have a function that describes the quality of the match between this template that you took, the subvolume or subregion from one image set, and some position that you've decided to evaluate in another image. The function tells you how good the match is. So fundamentally what you're doing is you're moving around in the new image volume, new displacement positions, new rotation positions, and you're always asking the question, how good is the match? How good is the match? How good is the match? And if you do that in a global search sense, you get images that look like this in 2D. You've got the global optimum. That's what you want to find. You want to find to extreme precision the local location of that global optimum. But you'll notice that there's local optima everywhere, and the local optima are very closely spaced to the global. The whole art of doing this is managing that type of optimization problem. And by close, I mean the distance between this global optimum and this first round of local optima may be 2 pixels. That may be two voxels away. And that means if you're going to do any sort of reasonable optimizer, you need to start from within 1, 2, 3 pixels or voxels of where you need to be. So without this good starting point approach, without feeding that information forward, it's very difficult to get that reliability in finding global optima. This is what it looks like in 3D. These were kind of fun to generate. And by the way, these are generated by doing what you would call a global or exhaustive search, where you just calculate the objective function value everywhere. As you know, with optimizers, you never actually see this map. You're actually going to a starting point that you hope is in a reasonable place. And then you're invoking a process, there's many of them, to crawl your way to the peak of the optimum and find it precisely. So you never see these, but it's useful to see them. The person I learned the most from when I was a student, know thy objective functions, establish good starting points. That was like a mantra for nonlinear optimization. And I think it's still true. It really is important to take that perspective. Here's what it looks like in 3D. If you have something that looks kind of like volumetric speckle, you get something that looks like a 3D version of that. So what the code is trying to do is trying to find its way to the very center of this little red blob here. That's the proper place. That represents the displaced location. But you can see that it's not very big, and there's little global minima, or there's little local optima around it. So again, if you start a process close to this place you need to be, then you're going to reliably get to the global optimum. If you don't, you either have to spend a tremendous amount of computational time mapping out what the region looks like from an optimization standpoint, or you're going to get lost, or you're going to be randomly bopping around to local optima, which is going to completely throw off your result. So this is what you're managing. This is the scary bit from a DVC standpoint, is when you work with materials that have texture in them, you can end up with optimization spaces that look like this. They're not only all these characteristics, but they're distorted. And this is an additional challenge in doing the optimization. This is where we're experimenting with those elongated subvolumes. If you create those, you get this into a little bit better shape in terms of an optimization process. But the real thing that drives this is the maps will all look similar. They'll share general characteristics as you move through a point cloud, but every single point is a new optimization. So you're doing this many, many times. I will get rolling here so we can get to some more of the nitty-gritty. This is what the code produces. Each point, its original position, status. I'll scroll through these. This is the displacement output. Point label, position, some status information from the optimization, and the displacement value. That's what you're after. These, in this case, are sorted by this distance metric. When the code generally runs, I put these out in the order that you put them in to the point cloud file. But this just shows you that you actually process these in this distance-wise manner to assist with this learning process. Here's the point positions. That's your point cloud. This is an indicator of how the optimization went. And we try to trap 2 types of common problems. One is if the process is converged, but to a value that you decide is unreasonable. In other words, if you expect 5 pixels of deformation and you get 50, kind of know that point didn't work. Or if there's a number of iterations that are excessive. I code those results so you know that that point's not reliable. This is a measure of quality of the optimization. These functions generally have the form where if that number is 0, that was an absolutely perfect match, which you don't ever get because you've got noise and other things in the image values. So if these values get too high, this is a tough thresholding decision, but if they get too high, you can decide that I don't think things are going well in this part of the image volume. So that's information on the process that when you feed it through and can evaluate it, it helps you understand if things are working correctly. And then we've got what we're after. It seems, after all that work, it seems kind of simple. You just get X, Y, Z, you get displacement values. But the reason why that's useful is when you're doing mechanics, here's the post-processing. I'll just give you the basic outline of a simple process that works. The first thing I always do is you drop that text file into MATLAB and you do a 3D quiver plot. And you get these little displacement vectors mapped three-dimensionally in space. You can look at them. You can decide if they look reasonable or not. And that's very informative. Always, it's kind of like with FEA. You always want to look at displaced structure just to see if things look like they're reasonable. So those vector plots are very useful. This is the only bit of math in here, and I'm not going to elaborate too much. I just want to show you the general flow. For mechanics, we want strain measures. And here's where an important issue comes in, is that this is what DVC generates fundamentally, at least this style of DVC is displacement vector information. If you want strain, the first thing you have to do is calculate these deformation gradients. This is used extensively in mechanics work. And notice what you did. These are alternative forms, by the way. I kind of like D. Some people like F. They're closely related to each other. But the problem is we've got a differential operator in here. We're differentiating measurement data, which is always a bit tricky. So every bit of noise in measurement is amplified. So this is one of the reasons why this process needs to be really controlled carefully, is to get precision high enough for mechanics so you can do this. Correlate well, filter judiciously is kind of the guideline here. It's very common to take displacement information and do some sort of filtering as a way to help with this differentiation process. But as with all those things, you want to be a little bit careful in doing that. But don't hesitate to try it. It can really help out. And then what you're doing for strain is you're taking these deformation gradients and reformulating it into either a small strain representation or a large strain representation. A lot like the bone work we're doing, small strain is going to work fine. Intervertebral discs, we'll probably use a Lagrangian strain formulation just because the deformations are bigger. And here's something that I do want to emphasize is these produce a second-order tensor matrix of strain component values. So we've got the normal strains, which indicate stretch, and we've got shear strains in the off-diagonal positions. If you're not used to manipulating these quantities and interpreting them from a mechanics standpoint, if that's what you're after, you need to find someone that's got some background in that. It's not a simple process. The strange thing is that you almost never interpret the components of this tensor directly. The meaningful parameters are extracted from here, but they're not directly the component values. There are things like principal strain vectors, maximum shear strain, things like that. These second order tensors have a very intricate sort of orientation aspect to them. And so you definitely want to sort of team up with somebody that's got some mechanics experience in order to know where to go here. Because I see lots of material come through for review, for manuscripts and things where they're like, oh my gosh, LXX changed dramatically from one state to another. We're onto something here. And that can be that one set of samples was oriented like this and one set of samples was a few degrees angled. You can have exactly the same mechanics going on in the two systems. Nothing changed except one's rotated a little bit. These numbers start varying all over the place. The extracted parameters remain the same. So you really do want to kind of get familiar with that part of it. It's not trivial. Here's an easy way to do this within MATLAB is if you're familiar with these mesh grid data processes, they're used quite a bit in data analysis. Is you're creating a regularized grid. Remember, our point clouds might not be on a regular grid basis at all. You're creating a regularized grid, you're interpolating your results onto that regular grid. And then you can bring in a gradient function. And this will calculate that deformation matrix for you. And then you go on and calculate the strain tensors. We've used this quite a bit. It works pretty well. It's not, I think, the best way to go. The best way is to use local neighborhood approaches. This is one of the things that I'm implementing in this code as soon as I get the chance to do it. I've done this before. It's just not in the current instantiation. I've done a 3D sort of extension of this idea from this paper. And it's a very nice flexible way of, now you're saying around a measurement point, I want to look at the neighborhood of the displacement values around that point. And I'm going to find the gradients in that local neighborhood. And that's what I'm going to use as my strain value for that measurement point. So this is there's more elegant ways than the MATLAB approach that use this concept. This is what the commercial codes do for digital image correlation work. So they're quite reliable. They're well understood, just a matter of code. That's coming up. All right. So here's where I think things can go. It often comes up, can I just parallel process this? In other words, can't I send the point cloud out to a bunch of different nodes and run them? The answer is yes. We've done work where we had very well registered image volumes and there's not much displacement in the sample. And in that case, the regions of the point cloud are kind of independent of each other. Give them all a starting point that's relatively good and they'll go off and run. But think about this moving information forward process. It becomes a bit complicated to just send all of this point cloud to different nodes. So some sort of way of using kind of branching strategies to start this process and essentially generate a set of global starting points and then moving those to different processors, I think is perfectly feasible to do. It just hasn't quite been put into code yet. The other thing is scripting. Is sometimes we do sequences of analyses. So we do a DVC and you take that result and you update the point clouds for your subvolumes from there. So you kind of sequence the analyses through. So you're constantly updating what your subvolumes look like. And that's quite easy to do. This is an almost trivial Python scripting process here. You take displacements, you feed them back and you add them to the original point cloud, and then you run that next. And then you take the displacement values and you add them to the original, that point cloud, and you feed through. So this is going to be quite easy to do and will definitely make sequential analyses easier to pull off. So I'll wrap this up really quickly. Oh, my little box is in the wrong spot. That little square is supposed to be, this is where you spend a lot of time. You have to think carefully about what your point cloud should look like and follow some basic guidelines for how to set it up. These parameters are critical in all image correlation processes. Is you want to know shape, size, and number of points. This has been quite interesting. Since I'm not tied to the voxel space at all, I can put as many or as few points within a subvolume as I want. And I found that fewer sometimes works incredibly well, and more just takes longer processing. So this is something you can work with in terms of setting up an analysis. And then finally, these parameters for most work, this set of parameters you can leave exactly like this. This set of parameters you can leave exactly like that. These two things are problem specific, and you need to manually go into your image data, figure out the first point in your point cloud, what's a displacement for that very first point, and you manually enter that information in the input file. That's doable with simple ImageJ processes. You just kind of move images around and find displacement values for that one special point, and that sets up the whole process. And then finally, some acknowledgements that the people I've just met that worked with the software. I'm very pleased that that process has gotten rolling. This is a big group that I've worked with here. Catherine's here. We just finished a beam time where we've got about 5 years worth of image data now to process, but we did some very interesting intervertebral disc work. And Andy and Robert I've worked with and know from time to time and previously. Kamala Loic, I think a lot of you know, they've spent quite a bit of time here. This is in the bio work, for the bone work, this is a group at RBC that provided a lot of these samples that they worked with. And of course, Peter Lee's the one that's been largely supporting my efforts to come out here and get engaged with this facility. So with that, I'm happy. I know ran a little bit long, but I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has them.
Okay, well, if anybody absolutely needs to rush off, don't be embarrassed. But I think we can stick around and ask a few questions if you wish. So after that study of biology, sampling theory, mathematics, and imaging,
it's kind of a jumble.
And programming.
That's right.
And floor.
Yeah, Dave.
I think the point between cloud definition is very important.
It is.
Using kind of benchmark approach to find that. I think.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain kind of, again, practically what you do, what you're aiming for?
You know, I can only put it in the context of when I think about finite element analyses. In general, if you have a region you're not particularly interested in, not much is going on, you can put fewer points there. If you're in a region where you're very interested and there's high deformations, there's a lot of strain, you put more points there. And always this very careful management of edges and boundaries. I can't emphasize that enough. If you try to do correlation and you have points where you've got these edge problems, it just does not work well. And I don't think it's going to work well. I think it's a fundamental thing with what the what the image data is, and also just having this idea of a region overlap. But I think the basic idea is, if you think like where do I really want information and where are the large changes, those can largely drive what the density and shape of the point cloud looks like. Yes, Christoph.
You were talking about large changes. What about the sensitivity of all that? What are the limits towards the lower limit?
If you have texture in the samples that has the characteristics of these optimized speckle, and optimized speckle is a pretty well-defined thing. In 2D, if you have small features that are, say, they're quite small. It's the edges that contain the information in these patterns. If you have features that are about 5 pixels across, and you have 3 by 3 to 5 by 5 of those pixels in there, and your image noise is very low, you can get 1/100th of a pixel or better. If you replicate, the closer you replicate that in volume work, the more you're going to push towards that goal. But I think practically, if you're getting 1/10 of a voxel, you're doing pretty good. And I think that's mainly because you always have time issues when you're collecting volume data. You want to scan quickly. These biological samples are always moving and relaxing a little bit. And so some of the just practicalities of imaging, you could get lower noise image, but you have to sacrifice that a little bit to just practically get the time aspect under control. What we do to try to assess that number is we do it empirically. So we will do a scan of a sample and then a repeat scan without doing any in situ manipulation at all. And you go through the measurement process, you find your displacements and you find your strains. And those can give values that give you at least a good indication. The bone work, when we were imaging at roughly a micron resolution, we were showing standard deviations of displacement values that were down around 50 nanometers. And that was done empirically by doing these repeat scans. So I think you could spend forever trying to understand in detail the contributions of resolution and noise and all of that, where quick empirical, not quick, you have to do another scan, but the repeat scanning with no in situ manipulation is what I think the sort of benchmark. You evaluate that, and that will give you a good indication of what level you can go to.
Any further questions? Anybody from Zoom have a question for us? I was going to ask a little bit, maybe you touched on it a bit, about running problems in parallel.
Right.
In the sense of either coarse or simple-minded parallelism, where you could use the code as it is and just divide the problem into several quasi-independent problems.
Right.
And maybe you mentioned that you have had some experimentation in that direction. How far has that taken you so far?
I think it really goes back to it's a problem dependent thing, and it goes back to here. These bone samples with relatively small deformations. It's a pretty rigid material, and those we registered. So we moved them. We moved our loaded sample into as close a registration as possible with the unloaded just within the voxel space. And if you do that, that global starting point information kind of applies for pretty much the whole sample. So you can reliably use that to start the optimization process. And if that's the situation you're in, you can literally just divide up the point cloud. You can take X number of points and send them to another processor and run it. And we did that, and it speeds up exactly how many cores that you have. It's a completely linear process. The bigger problem is things where there's quite a deformation through the sample. We're looking at these simulated magma samples, and there might be 30 voxels of deformation across one sample. So in that case, any point that you start with and you have good displacement information, the good displacement starting point is going to be 30 pixels different when you get to the other side of the cloud. But I've started to play around with ways I think you could do strategies like you sort of run a line from start to end, and you can correlate points along that path. And now you basically have a set of starting point values, and you can basically branch off from there. So you might do an initial process that sets up starting point information for for the whole region. And then you could automate the process of creating these little subclouds that you then sent off. So a little cloud would be generated, sent to another processor along with a good starting point information, and then that's going to run on its own. So I think it takes a little bit of that kind of database type thinking and management of the starting point information to make it more automated. But it seems very feasible to me. I think it's understood enough what's going on to make that work.
Any further questions, comments?
Maybe I have one. So this bone seems to be pretty extreme in the selection of the point cloud, is it? So maybe...
I think it is.
So
it's one of the more difficult ones.
Right. So maybe more normal type of samples which are not homogeneous, but do not show this heterogeneity.
That'd be a simpler process.
I mean, even the simple cylinder of the magma you were discussing, as the pressure is applied, it becomes that shape. So we probably want to manage that, or else you have to ignore that, that area that bulges. So
you can do that. Yeah, it's surprising how much you get into these little bit more complex scenarios. Like if you have a fracture opening up and you want to know strain at the tip of the fracture, you can't just have subvolumes overlapping the fracture itself. You need to actually manage the subvolume so you have information that's appropriate. And if you have voids within a sample, it's pretty common you're studying samples where I want to know what's going on around a void, or I want to know what's going on around an interface or around a fracture. And it's surprising, those take a pretty careful management of the point cloud. You can do an initial analysis. A lot of times you create a very simple region of interest and you run an analysis and you can see where anomalous things are going on. And then you can look more closely in there and do a more refined analysis at those local positions. But yeah, sometimes it's not as difficult. Nice cylindrical sample being squished axially, you have a little bit better time setting up the initial point cloud.
Any further questions or comments?
It's warm and it's late afternoon, so.
But Brian will be around for the rest of the day. People who want to speak with him, now is the best time to work that out. Also, briefly mention Eduardo Pascal, who mentioned there, is sitting right here. He's managing the CCPi project over at R89 on the STFC side, and has taken a copy of Brian's code and managed to run it here and there. that successfully. So in the future, when Brian's back in Origin, you can talk to myself or Eduardo, especially about deploying such code. And we'll thank Brian.
All right. Thank you.